Hi guys, welcome to the Lexicon podcast 2021. I'm Chris Orr and I'm joined by Paul Rim and Roland Bourne. So today we're going to talk about a few global issues, some cultural stuff and some linguistic stuff. So let's start off with COVID Watch. So Roland is an editor for Japanese and Paul is an editor for Russian. So Roland's going to start off by talking a bit about COVID in Japan and what that could mean for the Olympics.
Okay, so COVID in Japan. So at the start, when COVID struck last year, Japan actually did it surprisingly well. Unlike England and all the other countries in Europe, Japan managed to stay relatively low throughout, and only had a really good health service to stop the COVID impact. Now, everyone thought this was due to the Japanese health system, but actually recently there have been massive spikes in COVID cases in Japan, and this meant, as with England, shops closing, schools closing, and stuff. So recently, Japan was scheduled to hold the 2020 Olympics. This was initially scheduled to take place at the end of July 2020, but unfortunately, due to COVID, has been postponed into March. So the Olympics mean a lot of different things in Japan, but it's actually the first time the Olympics were actually postponed rather than cancelled. And Japan has named this operation Tokyo 2020. So Japan also is the first Asian city to potentially hold the Olympics twice, the first being in 1964. Also, events such as the Rugby World Cup in 2019, this Olympic holding means a really big deal for Japanese tourism and country culture. So it's obvious why they're trying to go through with it, despite a global pandemic. They're still trying, even now, to go through. So when COVID-19 hits, concerns are raised by impact on COVID-19 on athletes and visitors. The Tokyo organizers insisted that they had control over the disease, but obviously this wasn't true due to the rising cases right now. So there was no working vaccine at the time where the Olympics were postponed, but the Tokyo governors still tried to push through and only stopped in last September when other countries such as Canada and Australia threatened to withdraw their athletes from the Olympics. Now, obviously, the athletes' welfare is a major concern over the Olympics, as doing sport is their job, and if they get ill from COVID, their career is just over. So obviously, this is the main reason why the Olympics are cancelled. Secondly, it's obvious that Japan is a very touristy place, and people enjoy going to Japan, and that coupled with the Olympics would overflow tourism so much that COVID-19 would inevitably spread, as it is now, but will inevitably spread over all the tourists in all Japan. Now, obviously, Japan doesn't want this to happen. So Japan cancelled the Olympics on those grounds as well. But instead of technically cancelling the Olympics, they rescheduled to a date below 2021, but not later than summer 2021, which is now. And last March, they announced a date between 23rd of July and 8th of August. And when January 2021 comes around, the games would have to be cancelled, as the Japanese government was rumoured to privately conclude that they would cancel the games, that's it. However, the Japanese government denied that these rumours are categorically untrue, and that they're still trying to go for the Olympics. And this was supported by other presidents such as Biden and our beloved Boris Johnson here, who said that they would do whatever they could to push the Olympics and wholly in support for the 2021 Olympics. So as of May now, the games are officially still supposed to happen in August, but obviously many people, we're looking at COVID right now. I mean, schools in Japan, schools are kind of half closed. Like they can go some days, but not other days. And shops are open, but a lot of prefectures, that is counties, a lot of prefectures in Japan have restrictions similar to around here like a week ago. So Abe stated that the games, quote, stand as a beam of hope to the world during troubled times, end quote. And in recent times, Japan is determined to carry through games whatsoever may happen. However, the detriment of the games and the cancellation of the games, which I think will definitely go through, have a huge economic impact on Japanese tourism, as they're potentially losing out on so much money that they could kind of squeeze out from the games on an economic standpoint, as well as spreading culture, Japanese culture throughout the world.
So, Roland, what's the current situation with visitors to the games in August?
So the current situation right now is that there will be no visitors allowed whatsoever to spectate the games, and we're hoping to host it on TV, but on no account should visitors. Like, it's really hard for visitors to go to Japan as of now, and I'll just say a flat no for anyone trying to go there.
Yeah, that's a real shame, but hopefully they can get lots of money back through the TV rights, which are a big part of the Olympics nowadays. So moving on to Paul, what's the COVID situation in Russia? Obviously, they don't have like an Olympic-style event happening, but there's lots happening in Russia with COVID.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey for for Russia over the past year, but as of the current condition, the daily new cases actually has remained pretty static, under 10K per day, and comparatively to the UK sits at around half of that, I believe now. And there's been no real increase since over the past couple months, and there's also been no lockdown within Russia since, I believe, spring of 2020. So they've taken quite a different approach. Everyone is wearing masks. That is the mandate from the Russian government. But there have been no enforced lockdowns. People are still going to their jobs. Shops are still open, and part of the reason for that is the government's, I think, hesitance to enforce a second lockdown, because during the first one, they actually had to pay people to stay at home as part of the lockdown, and I don't think Russia has exactly, I wouldn't call it control, but they'd rather prioritize economic stability. They rather prioritize economic stability over the certainty of containing COVID in an airtight bubble, like in a lockdown setting. And for some of that, it has paid off, because they have developed something. They developed Sputnik 5. Now, Sputnik 5 is the Russian answer to Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and actually it's more similar to AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccine currently in development. Now, it's under a lot of scrutiny from Western sources, but within Russia, and the fact that it was, despite being not developed with full transparency, it's currently reaching 92% effectiveness from current rollouts, and because of that, it's actually doing quite well, and it's the gamble has paid off. And however, the only issue to Sputnik 5 is also local hesitancy. This time it's on part of the people, the Russian people. 62% of Russians, when polled, oppose getting the new vaccine. And I think part of the reason for that is kind of a distrust towards this lack of transparency, and also the lack of a formal address from the Russian head of state, Vladimir Putin. These addresses, whilst infrequent from the Russian president, are very impactful. They're nationally televised, state media. It's a big deal, but Putin hasn't done that yet. And in fact, he hasn't even reported, or there's no recording of him getting a vaccination yet. He has said that he's gotten a vaccine, but it still hasn't been confirmed. There's no video. There's no glamorous red tape event where he shows that Sputnik 5 is indeed safe for the general public to use. And because of that, there's just a general sense of uncertainty. And while rollout is still progressing within Russia, it's not as fast as you'd optimally want. And their main combating method, I've already said, is just masks. And part of the reason, I think, part of the reason why I think they're not as the Russian populace is not exactly as fearful, I'd say, is because Russia's gone through quite a lot of turmoil in recent years, and I'd say quite worse conditions. The fall of the USSR in the 1990s, that was a very dire situation for many Russians, and people who were in their 20s, then are in their 50s now, they remember they've had the grit to outlast those years, and I think it still carries over to this. They think this COVID crisis is something not as to be afraid of, even even if the death cases in Russia, from the excess death cases, which are they include not only direct deaths from COVID, but also the diaspora from that, fanning out into stuff like mental health, suicide, stuff like that. That's reached around, I believe, 300,000, if I'm not mistaken. But it's still, it's still under control in their mind, and because of that, it's not like the COVID vaccine is what's on everyone's mind currently. As a result, people are just going about their daily businesses, thinking that just masking up, taking hygiene measures would be enough.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Russia's had, even though right now it's sort of under control, Russia's had like a bit of a history with COVID. Like last year, lots of protests were shut down in the name of COVID security, even though Russia still had the stance that there wasn't much COVID in the country. So that's an interesting
there's a lot
dynamic.
despite the fact that like Sputnik 5, its development was behind closed doors, and later they released clinical trial data, and it's been shown from the rollout that it's effective. There's still that air of mystery, I guess, behind the puppet mastery in the Kremlin. But yeah, it's the whole idea of using COVID to justify shutting down demonstrations has somewhat been one-sided, because there have been notably, I believe, Alexei Navalny, one of the primary opponents to Vladimir Putin nowadays, who is not also jailed, I believe, recently. His supporters, his proponents, a lot of their demonstrations have been placed under greater pressure from local authorities, saying that it violates COVID protocols. But Vladimir Putin's very own supporters, his rallies, they are not as much affected by it, and it's still striking that Putin's influence still permeates throughout COVID. He's utilizing it for his own advantage, and it's interesting to watch. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to a country that is really struggling with COVID right now, and that is India. So India right now has 200,000 active cases. About 2 weeks ago, that peaked at 300,000. And I just want to dive into some of the reasons why India is in a uniquely challenging place right now. I mean, the first is that it's a huge country. It's a struggle to get all of the different parts of India on the same page. It's got a huge population, and that's a real issue. So the local governments, it's hard for the national government to coordinate all the local governments onto one page. And India has quite poor medical infrastructure. So the ratio of doctors to patients is 1 per 1,500, and hospital beds is at 1 per 1,400. And it has been suggested that they would need 500,000 ICU beds to meet the current demand, and it currently has only 90,000. The vaccination rollout in India is okay at best. It's got one of the strongest vaccine producing infrastructures in the world, and it's producing a lot of vaccines. But the problem is, a lot of them are being exported, and the rollout countrywide is really slow. In the UK, we have delivered half as many vaccines as India has, but that means only over half the population has at least one dose, whereas India has delivered 100 million, and not that's not even a big proportion of their country. There's also questionable social distancing in India right now. Prime Minister Modi has had a bunch of political rallies which have been really criticized for having very poor social distancing. It almost like in Russia, but they Modi is trying to cement his position as prime minister, and having these rallies is a big step towards that. But they are huge rallies, and they have been criticized for causing a lot of transmission. Almost 3 million people gathered on the banks of the Ganges to celebrate a Hindu festival recently, and that has been very heavily criticized for being a real hotspot of transmission. There's also the new variant. It's hard to say what the new variant means. We basically just know that the India variant is different, and we have to go off a very small sample size to suggest that it is more deadly and more transmissible. But it's really hard to know. It could just be that India is just struggling to contain transmissions, and that has led to greater transmissions among this variant. But it is causing concern because we've studied the current COVID-19 virus significantly, but we have not studied many of these variants too much, and we don't know whether the vaccine will be effective versus this variant, and we don't know whether it's got a higher mortality rate. So those are big worries for India. There's also an issue with statistics reporting. There's been a push for regions to report results that suit the government's agenda. Back to Modi trying to cement his role as prime minister. So when it was pushing for an easing of lockdown rules at the end of last year, statistics seem to have been slightly doctored, meaning to support a relaxation of the rules, meaning that this could just be the first wave continuing into this year, rather than a significant spike like we've seen in other countries, especially in Europe. So the path out of COVID for India is looking difficult, but with more vaccine production ramping up and a diversion of vaccines into the country rather than exporting, there is a lot of optimism in India that they can get it under control. And looking at the graph of COVID cases right now, it's gone from 300,000 to 200,000 active cases in the space of about 3 weeks. So it's looking out for India, but they're not out of the woods just yet. So on a more cheery note, we're going to talk about a few countries that you might be able to go for summer holidays. So my pick for that is Portugal. Portugal being in the EU, very easy to get to, but it is in a very similar place to the UK right now. The UK, we're looking very happy right now. Like bars are open, pubs are open, you can eat outside. Portugal's in a very similar position. They've got a good vaccine rollout for the EU, and bars are open, but they have the curfew of 10 p.m. that we had a few months ago, well before the most recent lockdown. And so if it follows the same path that Britain follows, there is a very good chance that you will be able to travel to Portugal for the summer holidays. And this is also a green list country, so getting back into the UK, you will not have to quarantine coming from Portugal. Right, I think Roland, you had one.
Yeah, so my pocket pick for this holiday is going to the Maldives. Now, the Maldives, if you didn't know, are a small bunch of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And the primary reason for going to them, in my opinion, is just to go snorkeling and diving. So the Maldives is so biodiverse, and there's so many fishes and coral reefs to go to. It's like a Great Barrier Reef, but in India. Now, obviously, COVID in the Maldives has been rising. So as of now, the border might get closed off if it continues rising, and especially the new Indian variant. It can easily spread over to these islands if we're not careful and quarantining. But honestly, if your family want to go for a nice paradise after being locked up for close on a year now, I think Maldives is a great option, similar to the Caribbean basically, but a bit smaller. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great choice. From what I've seen, the Maldives, they are really pretty, and being a small island, they have suffered less from COVID than many other countries. So I'm sure they're eager to get tourism back. So moving on to a global politics section now. I think we're going to talk about China and Taiwan. So Paul, take us away.
So China and Taiwan, they've had quite a turbulent history, to say the least. And part of the issue with recently between Taiwan and China is the ramping up of military, I would say exercises or aggressions towards Taiwan's sovereignty. And what happened recently was that on April 12th, reported by several outlets, 25 Chinese military jets breached Taiwan's defense zone. So that's basically their airspace on Monday. And the problem was with this, in conjunction with the fact that over the prior year, there have been over 300 violations, but this is the largest one by far. It's that Taiwan, along with Western nations such as the U.S., who are big proponents of Taiwanese independence from the Chinese state, they think that China is becoming increasingly more aggressive in trying to claim land that they think that is theirs, or assert more influence is perhaps a better way to put it. As we've all seen with Hong Kong, where the Chinese government has began influencing local politics and the local area in general, not just through shows of force through the Hong Kong police force, but also through stuff like the Causeway Bay Books disappearance, in which there was a bookstore in Hong Kong that sold quite fiery books that detailed salacious lives of Chinese politicians that are obviously not allowed in mainland. The people who worked at this bookstore gradually they all disappeared. Some of them resurfaced, some of them didn't. But it's among one of the many instances where China has shown began asserting themselves throughout not only Hong Kong, but now it's kind of moving into Taiwan, and it's worrying currently a lot of the locals because they're worried about what their future is. It's an certainly a prospect to be fearful of, whether it means going to war with China, whether it means assimilating into perhaps a completely different system where Taiwan has pretty stable democracy, and kind of transitioning into a one-party system, and it's left a lot of people with that kind of fear.
Yeah, so I mean, the US is a big ally of Taiwan, even though they don't recognize Taiwan as an official country. They are a big ally of Taiwanese independence, and the big concern with most Western countries and about Taiwan is that China is expanding their territory into something that's not theirs. But the Chinese view on that is that Taiwan is just part of China. This is a purely internal affair, and it just views Taiwan as a runaway province that has no right to independence.
Yeah.
So that the one country, two systems sort of approach from Beijing is quite at odds with the US view of Taiwanese independence. So I think for many of us, we'd hope that the new presidency would at least dull lots of the tensions between US and China that's characterized the last 4 years. But I think that this Taiwan flashpoint could be a big problem in like soothing relationships over the next few years. But like, I mean, this has been a big flashpoint in the past. Like, when I searched up this topic to research it, BBC article from 2015 had exactly the same wording and exactly the same issues as ones I read today. So this is a really historical struggle and tension. It's not going to go anywhere fast, and it's flared up in the past. But hopefully nothing serious will come of it this time. All right, so moving on to some cultural recommendations. I think Roland's got a Japanese book that he'd like to share.
Oh, yes, I do. So I'm actually currently reading this book in Japanese right now. And obviously, I can't exactly read Japanese properly yet, so it's been a bit of a struggle. But I have been enjoying this thoroughly. And if you want to grab a hold of a copy in English, I'd recommend it. So the book's name is Kafka Musho, and the author is called Furuji Murakami. So this book, straight off the bat, this book is different from the average sort of book we know in England. So to put it plainly, the book tells two stories at once. So kind of two narratives. And the catch is that every odd chapter is one story, and every even chapter is the second story. So every odd chapter, we follow the story of Kafka. Kafka is a young boy who's 12, and he's on a quest, sort of like adventure quest. He has an Oedipus curse on him, which is from the Greek person Oedipus, which is that he hates his father and loves his mother for some reason. But yeah, the general quest of his is to just go around and find his mother and sister. And going on to the next narrative, every even chapter, remember, this follows the story of Nakata, who is a young man whose job is to find lost cats and reunite them with their owner. And the story is, one day he's reuniting a lost cat with someone, and then he gets a sort of inspiration, and a sort of like he gets an idea of following something, and he befriends a lorry truck driver and goes to find his destiny. It's a bit of a weird way to put it, but so the story is, I think the story is really good in a way that it kind of hints that these two separate narratives are entwined, but it doesn't actually set it in stone. Like the story is, I think, contains a lot of riddles. I haven't read the whole book yet, actually. I think the story contains a lot of like riddles and mysteries, but you have to read the book multiple times to find out, to like grasp everything. It's kind of like Harry Potter or something, in the sense that there's so many like deep things hidden in it, but you need to really understand it. But yeah, I'm really enjoying that book. I've been about 3/4 of the way through, but if anyone wants to give it a go, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, so great. Have you read any other books by Murakami?
No, this is the first one actually.
Yeah.
But I'm liking the author, so honestly, after I finish Kafka and Bashir, we'll go to the next one.
Great, yeah, because I think this book is very characteristic of Murakami. He takes a lot of inspiration from sort of surreal ideas that are almost impossible to grasp at first glance, but reading the book multiple times, you get a deeper understanding each time of what's happening, and you can look at different parts of the narrative in isolation and get a completely different story.
Yeah, honestly, exactly. That's exactly it.
Great. Paul.
Yes. So recently I finished watching a Malaysian film. It's a Malaysian produced film, but released in Mandarin Chinese for anyone who's interested. It's called Guang, Guang. It's basically a drama film it's a drama film that follows a young autistic man, uh, named Wen Guang. He's obviously, as I mentioned, he's autistic. Has trouble socializing with people. He can't hold down a job. He's really struggling in that sense, especially as we can see throughout the story, how he's continuously rebuffed by society. And when he finds a hidden talent, in this case it has to do with music. So if anyone interested in that, he decides to put his heart into it, and it follows him as he continues that struggle. And the ending's quite beautiful, really. I won't spoil it too much, obviously, but it's a great film. It's a great film, not just because of the really touching story, but also how it reveals in East Asia, there's a lot of stigma against mental illness. It's perceived as a weakness, perceived as it's perceived as a weakness. It's not something you honestly want to brag about. It can bring a lot of dishonor into family, and that's something that's shown quite a bit, as you know, as having an autistic brother or an autistic son can be quite difficult, bring embarrassment perhaps, and it really outlines, the existing stigmas that trouble people with a condition like autism. And this is actually a full-length adaptation from a 2011 short film uh, by the same director, Chek Shou Chuan. Sorry if I messed up the name, but it's really just a touching story, and it's about an hour. It's about an hour and 30 minutes, so good watch on Sunday.
Great, yeah, that sounds like a really awesome film. Like I think it shows that the power of film to touch on deep social issues that I think especially in East Asia, mental illness is definitely something that needs to like be addressed. Like the Japanese idea of death by overwork, people just working themselves and then their mental health just fails. So my cultural thing I want to touch on is Kpop. Anyone knows me knows I enjoy listening to Kpop, but it's not actually a recommendation. It's why a little bit of explanation why I don't think I can recommend many Korean bands to Western listeners. So there are a few factors, but most of them boil down to the fact that artists are controlled to a far greater degree by their record labels, and this leads to artists being a bit of like a marketing project. And anyone knows anything about marketing is that new things sell a lot. So what often happens to Korean groups is that they will come out with an awesome debut album the label has worked really hard to perfect and really hard to hype up, and that's great. But then there are generally two paths for a Korean band. Either the second album is really good and better than the first, and the band usually becomes a lot more mainstream after that. Or the second album doesn't quite live up to the hype. Sales go down, the label puts in less resources, and eventually the band sort of fizzles out. And this happens to so many bands that it becomes really hard to recommend them because you never know how long they'll be around. Like every band is just liable to a label losing interest in their marketing potential and just cutting them off completely. The second factor is Korean mandatory military service. This is a big talking point with my favorite band, BTS. They're perhaps the model of the label artist relationship, but they also have this another stumbling block of military service, and they've survived for 7 years, but their career will probably be cut short because they have to take 20 months in the military. And even though artists have come back from this, in the fast-moving world of pop music, you can often be forgotten in 2 years if you don't have anything to release. And artists usually become worse performers in that time. Like this is why it feels hard to recommend K-pop bands that aren't super mainstream and super long-lived to Westerners, because unless you're really into the scene and finding new groups all the time to add to your playlists and whatever, your group of bands that you enjoy will always be shrinking because bands will be cut off, bands will have diminishing audiences all the time. And it might just be me, but if I'm investing energy into supporting and enjoying a band, I do want it to be around for a long time. And that is a big stumbling block I think, for Korean uh, pop that needs to be overcome. It's getting better in recent years. There are a lot more bands that labels are releasing less bands and investing in them more, but it's still a big issue that I find that they need to work around. I want to talk about linguistics and how language learning affects your brain. So you often hear language teachers go on and on about how good learning languages for your overall brain function, but they usually don't give a good reason why or vaguely point to languages being complex as a reason for increasing your brain function. However, even if you can't put a finger on it intuitively, people who know many languages do tend to perform better than those who don't. I've always been really interested in this because even though I'm not bilingual, I have tried to learn quite a few languages, and I've even been to a different language school for a year. And recently I read a book called The Bilingual Brain by Albert Costa, which tries to give a scientific insight into how learning a second language affects your brain. Most of the change from bilingualism is caused by the training of your brain to switch languages. I'll first ask Paul, what do you think happens when you change languages in your brain? Like what functions change when you switch languages?
I'd say the main changes that occur when you're trying to switch between languages, it's trying to make changes between grammar structure. It's trying to find if you're trying to speak in a if you're trying to speak in Russian, let's say, you have to, and there's just a word that you're stumbling over, and you can't seem to decline it properly. You can't find a suitable word. You have to sometimes just pause, and that just interrupts everything. So part of the thing of learning a second language and becoming proficient at it is where you can do it kind of unconsciously. I don't want to say that's not the right word perhaps, but you don't want to be putting a lot of strain into it. It's something that you can just link words together without much thought, and eventually it becomes second nature as a result. It's why when people why people who come to different countries as immigrants, not exactly having the best language skills, over the years they pick up local colloquialisms and certain quirks of the language native to that area, and eventually over time they'll become good at it. They might not lose an accent because that's quite hard to lose unless you're speaking intentionally differently. But overall, that's language learning just becomes eventually innate. I'd say language becomes innate.
So overall, but you say that like when you have two languages in your brain, you're like there's like the Russian part and then there's like the English part, and you go over and you like when you're in Russian, you go and pick the words out from the Russian part, or you go and pick the words out from the English part. Is that what you say? It's like
if you're interpreting in one to the other, it's only really there when you're translating, because my thought is you can think, your subconscious can think in a certain language, let's say, because let's say if I'm talking to you, I'm probably thinking in English, right? Because and it's kind of just that I'm always thinking about it in English, but if I need to, I can switch over to Russian or a different language. Let's
Okay,
say.
great. Well, so one of the most interesting things I found about this book is that like languages actually just coexist all the time in your brain, and that like switching between languages is actually inhibiting one. So you have English and you have Russian words in your brain all the time, and when you're trying to speak and you try and find a particular vocabulary item in your brain, if you know the Russian word well enough, your brain will actually find both of them at the same time, but then your brain will actually just inhibit the Russian one because you know it's not in use anymore, which is like a really cool part of the. I found that really cool, and that's why language learning actually has such an effect on your general brain function, and this makes sense to anyone who has two languages because like it's hard to think that slipping between two languages accidentally is like accidentally picking the wrong word. It's just that your inhibitors um, can't don't inhibit the use of the other word. But it's important for these findings. Like the first, like bilingualism improves your executive functions, namely self-control, task switching, and working memory. Because you train the inhibitors in your brain, you can use these inhibitors to suppress all the stimuli that are not important to your task and focus on the task at hand. The experiment that demonstrated this was a classic conflicting stimuli experiment. A participant is shown a red or green circle. If it is red, they press a button on the right. If it is green, they press a button on the left. The catch is that the circle can appear on the left or the right hand side of the screen. When the circle appears on the opposite side of the screen to the answering hand, response times are longer for everyone, regardless of language learning. However, using bilingual people reacted less slowly to the conflicting stimulus, ending up in a route of reaction time about 20% faster. This gap decreased as the experiment went on, suggesting that monolinguals were training the same inhibitors that bilinguals already had. But for real-world applications, you often only get one chance to react to something and decide whether to get distracted by it. So you can put this down as sort of advantage to bilinguals in terms of brain function. It also has been suggested that bilingualism protects your brain from dementia through a slightly nebulous idea called cognitive reserve. A study done on mentally deteriorating patients in a hospital in Toronto found that those who knew a second language on average experienced symptoms of dementia about 4 years later than those who are monolingual. The theory behind cognitive reserve is that languages exercise areas of the brain that are typically hit by dementia first, so that effects are not as noticeable for a long time. The analogy that the author uses is, even if Messi loses some of his physical attributes as he gets older, he has such a footballing reserve that it will take many years before he becomes even an average footballer. Bilingualism is also associated with an increase in white and grey matter in your brain, both of which shrink when you get older. This is true in areas even not associated with language. And the good news for everyone who hasn't learned a language yet, the effects of languages learnt after age 11 are almost as effective as languages learnt from birth in this regard. I want to quickly mention some downsides that are associated with bilingualism. There's often been a political agenda for some people to say that learning two languages affects your control of either one. In one sense, this is based off some facts. When asked to recall low-frequency vocabulary items, bilingual people took 30 milliseconds longer to respond than monolinguals, suggesting there was some interference between languages. However, as you get older, this gap decreases. This is one of the few disadvantages the author raises, so perhaps it's safe to say that the advantages really do outweigh the negatives. Most of my information on this topic comes from the book by The Bilingual Brain, so if you're interested in the study of bilingualism, I'd definitely check it out. So that's about all. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you have any suggestions or want to feature a short piece, please get in contact with the Lexicon.